Is iHeart scamming the podcast industry? That's the implication of an article this week that was widely discussed in the podcasting world.
And now, a look at what's trending in the podcast world and how it can help your show. It's the Jack Show Podcast.
The story is from Bloomberg and written by Ashley Carman, one of the most respected reporters in our industry, linked, of course, in today's show notes. So advertising buys in podcasting are based on audience size, downloads, and streams. According to Carmen, publishers are buying ads inside mobile video games on your mobile phone. Players have to click the ad, which downloads the episode, and potentially listen to a minute of a podcast to get virtual loot to get to use in that video game. Now, the player gets something out of it, and so does the podcaster, an additional download number to sell to advertisers, even if the player is just trying to help themselves in the game and doesn't care about the podcast. The article further explains that the ads that are served in a podcast are inserted at the time of the download, not when you get to the mid-roll or the end-roll ad, which these gamers, of course, may never get to. So now the publisher can claim a dubious download, as well as an ad impression for a commercial that may not be heard if it's placed later in the podcast. Now, it is important to mention iHeart is not the only publisher doing this. The article cites the mobile game Subway Surfers as taking ads from the New York Post and independent podcaster Scott Savlov, as well as iHeartMedia. But Carmen says that iHeartMedia has spent $10 million and gained 6 million unique listeners through the game's publisher since 2018. And that has industry-wide repercussions when iHeart, depending on the month, is the top publisher based on audience size in podcasting. Are they gaming the system? Well, opinions are all over the map on that. For a deeper dive, you can check out this week's podcast, Super Friends Roundtable, where I discuss it with 4 of my colleagues, Matt Kundle of the Sound Off Media Company in Winnipeg, Canada, David Yaz of Pod 617 in Boston, Catherine O'Brien of Branch Out Programs in Baton Rouge, and Johnny Podcasts from Fort Worth, Texas, Straight Up Podcasts. Now, our conversation follows our discussion of co-hosts and what to do before you get podcast married. Link to the podcast is in our show notes. On the other side of things, Tanner Campbell suggests in his Good Morning Podcasters newsletter that iHeart isn't doing anything wrong here. He says the easy fix is make the required listening length for one IAB certified download 120 seconds, not 60. Problem solved. He also breaks down the math as to why he doesn't think this is as bad as the podcast industry fears. His newsletter linked in today's show notes. Here are my key takeaways. iHeart using this tactic and claiming they are, quote, #1 for podcasting makes that slogan about as reliable as your #1 hit music station, which many pop radio stations used back when they had DJs outside Morning Drive. Will the industry correct for this practice? After this much publicity, I believe it will. Much the same way Apple Podcasts and Google Search always finds a way to punish the folks who try to game the system. Also, will this affect your show? No. Unless you're in the rarefied air of a large podcast with huge download numbers that sells advertising based off of those numbers, this has no bearing on you or your show. If you're selling to advertisers that align with your brand and your mission, you'll be fine. Or if you don't have advertisers, as most shows don't, this is much ado about nothing. Focus on good content and having your listeners share it out in order to grow your audience. But there is a concern over anything that hurts the credibility of the podcasting industry. As it hurtles toward being a $2 billion industry, the magnifying glass is only getting bigger. And to quote a great philosopher of our time, ain't nobody got time for that. In other podcasting news, PodNews reports that the average length of a podcast is shrinking. According to an article from Rephonic, the average length of a top 100 podcast in 2018 was 53 minutes. Today, among shows with 10,000 or more listeners, the average length is just 37 minutes. This speaks to one of my golden rules of podcasting. Shorter is always better than longer. Always better to leave your audience wanting more than filling time and wasting your audience's valuable time. Keeping up with this trend is a new podcast from the CIA. It's called The Langley Files, and its description says its mission is, quote, to educate and connect with the general public, sharing insight into the agency's core mission, capabilities, and agility as an intelligence leader, and to share some interesting stories along the way. So much for we tell you, but we have to kill you. And finally, if you think Stephen A. Smith was annoying yelling about sports, wait until he branches out. He has a new podcast called No Mercy. Personally, I'll take mercy on my eardrums and skip it. Don't miss an episode of the Jag Show podcast. You can subscribe in your favorite podcast app where you're listening right now, or just have it emailed to you every week. I promise not to spam you. Just go to jagindetroit.com/subscribe. Until next week, stay healthy and stay safe, especially our friends in Florida. Later.
The most popular ways to grow a podcast are recommendations of friends and family. So share this episode with someone you know. And for any questions you have about podcasts, find Jag online at jagindetroit.com.